certain St. George's slow a dragon. Something you know about that, Fred? I want to find out whether he relates to history of Prince George's County being erected 296 years ago, or whatever that dragon slaying at St. George's was. But in any event, I'm going to say very few words. I'm President of the Society. I welcome you here. We're pleased to present this series with the cooperation of the Community College and the History Division of Park and Planning Commission. We're trying to get a series established that will attract attention and interest around the county, and we're pleased that several of you have signed up for all of the sessions and others for a second or third session. Be sure to check the program before you leave, particularly if you enjoy yourself tonight, and let us know if you'd like to come back for one of the others. We began this series last fall with the Community College, and we hope to continue over a period of time. Tonight, one of our stars is to open up the series. Fred DeMarr is well known to lots of people, often affectionately or otherwise called the county historian. He is our librarian, our official historian of the society, and the one that most anybody turns to if they can't find answers somewhere else. And well-informed people come and ask him first. So without any further introduction, let me say that Fred DeMarr is a former president of our society, is the mainstay of the society's library efforts and other things relating to the history of the society and to the county. Fred?
Thank you.
I guess I should ask that at his choosing, there'll be a break in about an hour. There'll be a celebration of the birthday by having a piece of birthday cake. It'll be up to him to decide when he wants to stop talking and have a chance to move around. Thank you, Fred.
Just one preliminary at the present time before getting underway formally. This is going to be a very freewheeling sort of thing, not a real formal occasion. I want all of you to think of any questions you may have as I go along, and what we'll do after we have our break with birthday cake, come back. I want to hear some questions, all those questions that you always thought about as to why something is or isn't here in the county, or even about Maryland for that matter, and I will make an effort to answer those particular questions for you. I did not volunteer for this assignment this evening. I got a phone call from the current president of the society who said, well, the committee got together and we're going to have a lecture series, and it was unanimous consent and opinion of the committee that you are going to give the opening lecture. I hope you're available on the 23rd of April for the opening one on St. George's Day, which of course is the official birthday of the county. Is now our 296th birthday. The tricentennial will be in 1996. I might say one thing in passing is, as far as having any knowledge of the subject is concerned, share with you perhaps a humorous story, something that happened to me over at the university back in the fall. I'm on the staff there, started on the faculty many years ago. I hate to say how many years ago it was, but I worked there at the student union. And my office there at the union, I'm in the operations, the bookings for banquets, weddings, you name it, and we keep that building running for all the programs that are held there. But my office there is probably about as wide as from, say, here to there, and not quite as deep. But on the interior, it very much resembles this room as far as pictures, paintings, maps, photographs, and all sorts of memorabilia. And the most fun I have is sitting there in the office, and whenever I'm in residence, the door is always left open. So people go by, and when they walk by, they catch out of the side of their eye, they will see this, and you'll see the different reactions. Some go by, and after they get by, they'll do a U-turn in the hallway, and they'll come back and walk by and catch it, and then another U-turn to get it on the second go-around, just to see what is actually in there. Others will go there, and as they do in the military, backward march or backward 2 paces, they will back up in that fashion to get a full view of what is going on. And others will just plain stop and walk in and say, what is this place? is it a museum? Is this the president's office? Many other similar to the alumni office, many other similar questions. And in the fall, the Diamondback, the student newspaper, came over and did an interview. And lo and behold, I thought nothing of it. And lo and behold, on the front page, about a couple days later, here's this gigantic photograph of myself standing beside my desk. That wasn't too bad, but above it, it had as a headline in Greek. Well, I've got a copy, but I didn't put it up on the wall here. It's so embarrassing. It says, DeMarr knows all. Imagine that's on the front page of the paper at the university. I got a lot of needling from my friends as a result of that. My interest in Maryland and Prince George's County history actually goes back to childhood, perhaps as a result of the family environment, as is the situation for many of our attributes. My father was born in Aquasco, and as a child was brought up to Washington. At about age 15, he went off to war in the Spanish War in the Marine Corps, and when he returned back, he lived in the city of Washington. A couple years later, he married my mom, who was a second cousin who lived in Upper Marlboro. Dad, in the time in the almost 5 years that he spent on active duty in the Marine Corps, had been in Cuba during the Spanish War and in most of the principal cities of South America, as well as a tour both through the Mediterranean and in the North Atlantic areas, the Mediterranean, even over into the areas of the northern ports of Russia in those early days. And seeing those places, I guess, at an early age, history made a great impression upon him. And it's something that sort of rubbed off on me somewhere along the line. And I have actually been actively collecting material about the county for about 50 years, maybe a little bit longer. Those filing cabinets over there on the end are all newspaper clippings out of newspapers, folders from different places and so forth. They're all either on the subject of Prince George's County or Maryland. No allied material in there. That's in another department, in another area, another filing cabinets, and it represents about a 50-year endeavor, although in 10 of those years I was not immediately in the area, and I was not in a position to actively collect at that particular time. The story of Maryland and Prince George's County actually goes back much earlier than 1634, when Maryland was founded. Sir George Calvert, who became the first Baron Baltimore of Baltimore in the Irish peerage, was an early pioneer in the area of colonization. He actually was a stockholder in the Virginia Company, which founded Jamestown in 1607. It was an economic thing, but he had personal, not only was it an investment, but he also had the personal interest in colonization as such. After that particular experience, he went out and did it on his own and purchased a piece of land in the so-called Newfound Land. We call it Newfoundland today. Talk to a Newfoundlander, he will promptly correct you and say it's Newfound Land. It's like understand. It rhymes with understand, pronounced the same way. And after he purchased this piece of land from another venturer in the area of colonization from England, he went out and got himself an official charter for the property so that he could have control over the government and completely be under no one else's control as far as this property is concerned. He called it Avalon. Avalon, of course, was the ancient site, the beginning of the site of the beginning of Christianity, according to legend in England, the place where Saint Joseph of Arimathea came over and put down his staff, and the so-called Glastonbury thorn sprouted there in England. He sent colonists over in 1619. It was a touch-and-go type of situation. Actually, I believe it's the summer of 1628, he came over in order to come up with a final decision as to whether it was really going to be a permanent thing or not, whether he was going to put more money in this venture or not, and brought his entire family, with the exception of Cecil, his eldest son. He left him in England to watch out for his business affairs, and he brought his wife and the rest of the children, all of the children, over with him to Avalon, spent the entire year through the winter. When he left there, he came, at the end of that year, he came by ship down to Jamestown, visited the governor there, and then went back to England. At that particular time, he made the decision of whether or not his primary source of revenue was going to be tobacco or codfish. There's a letter in the New York Public Library which is referred to as the tobacco or codfish letter. It's really a very difficult thing to read because his handwriting was extremely difficult to decipher. But he did make the decision that the weather was not conducive to a successful project in the Newfound Land. He did not relinquish his interest there. He didn't give up altogether, but he did turn his eyes to the south, and he got the charter for Maryland from the king, and hence we have our state of Maryland today. Of course, the charter did not pass the seal until after the death of Sir George I, Lord Baltimore. Cecil, his son, was the one who actually received the charter in 1632. 1633, the colonists left England from the Isle of Cowes, and they arrived here on March 25th in 1634. One thing about the background of the history of Maryland, the popular bit is that it was a Catholic colony. It was founded for religious purposes. I would say at the outset that that is a somewhat overworked point, and it's a true Catholics. He was Catholic. The Catholics were amongst the settlers here, but in stressing this particular point, it's been reduced to a very simplistic level, and actually you have to get the full story on it to understand actually what happened there. It was not founded as a Catholic colony. If it were, politically, you could not have survived in England. It would not have been politically correct at that time for him to do this. Where it was a departure is the fact that Catholics were allowed to come into this new area and to practice their religion. Actually, of the most of the so-called gentlemen of the settlers who came over on the Ark and the Dove were Catholics. Of the laborers, the common man, so as to speak, they were approximately 50-50 in number. But the fact that Catholics were permitted to come in here was a departure at that particular time. I mean, in other colonies, a couple of others later on, were wide open to people of all faiths and so forth. But at that particular time, there were also colonies where Catholics, so when Lord Baltimore went down to Virginia to visit on his way back from Newfound Land, they did not let him come ashore. He stayed on the ship, and the governor of Virginia went out and visited. They were old friends, came out and visited with him. They would not let him come ashore because they didn't want any of those Catholics in Virginia. I mean, it was just that particular way. So it was not founded as a Catholic colony, but Catholics were allowed was a major breakthrough for that particular time. Basically, the founding of Maryland was an economic thing, it was an investment, and it turned out to be a very good investment over the years for the several Lords of Baltimore who owned the property. Newfound Land, Avalon, was not a good investment. It was a very, very, very expensive experiment for a large amount of money. In fact, I don't think anyone ever really knew how much money he put in there. And I think it was one of those situations, where you go out and buy a whole lot of a certain type of stock. It's a good bargain and so forth. And then you talk about it a little bit, and then it turns out to be a real lemon. And then you don't say anything to anyone, whether it's your husband or your wife or your friends or anyone else. And that's just something you want to forget about. And that, I think, was somewhat of the situation as far as the Newfound Land was concerned. Maryland was an economic venture. I would say one thing as a matter of explanation here, that many times in talking to people and sometimes in reading things, you'll hear someone say that, oh, they live on a piece of property and their family or somebody else got a grant for that property here in Maryland from the King of England. Not so. There is only one grant from the King of England for property in Maryland, and that was to Cecil Collier, the second Lord Baltimore, for everything. All the land which changed hands initially to the first owner was those documents were signed, the patents were signed by the Lord Baltimore. He was the one who was selling, or in some cases giving it away because you brought others along with you to help people the land and make the economic machine begin to run. So there was only one grant from the Crown, and that was to the Lord Baltimore. As far as Maryland is concerned, the waterways were the roads in the early years, and that accounts for the fact that many of your early homes were built along the rivers, and it accounts for the fact that many early towns were along the rivers, and it also accounts for the fact that today, when highways have passed some of these peninsulas by, why you have ghost towns or just place names there today, when the highway has suddenly become a strip of concrete rather than a navigable body of water. During the 1600s, Maryland barely kept pace as far as the population was concerned. In the early years, they were not able to attract that many people of means who would help to make this economic thing run, and of course the death rate and keeping up with that with new people coming in. So actually, the 1600s were primarily a fairly sparse period of existence here in Maryland. In the 1700s, it began to get better. About 1740, 1750 is when you get into what was really the beginning of the golden age, from then up until the beginning of the Revolution, that things really began to blossom. In order to people the area and also to control trade, an effort was made on the part of the Lords Baltimore to establish towns in the 1690s. They went out and passed acts saying that there will be towns at these particular locations within these particular counties. And in fact, in Maryland and in Prince George's County, for instance, with few exceptions, most of your towns that existed prior to 1800 were not a result of a mill or a bridge or a ferry or something being in a location and so forth, and then the thing just naturally sprung up for an economic reason. Most of your towns up until 1800 were officially erected by Act of the Assembly. 1799, Vansville, just above Beltsville, up there on the hill. Vansville election district later on, and so was Vansville, was the last town in Maryland that was chartered by the Assembly, ahead of time. Today, you may go out and get a Calverton or something like that started from scratch. Then the people decide, well, we ought to have our own town government. And then they go in and get an act to incorporate themselves, get incorporated so they can have a mayor and collect taxes and take care of the usual town functions. Otherwise, you went the other way. When Bladensburg was started, that was vacant land, foreign land. The owner had no say in town. The government said, you're a good town. Say, we're going to put a super highway through your property today. Same principle, but they were developing towns. Prior to the time of the founding of Prince George's County, there were 10 other counties here in Maryland that preceded. The first one to be established as a county naturally was St. Mary's, 1637, 3 years after the first settlement here. Right after that, in 1642, you had Kent County, which you see right here. Now, the obvious reason as to why Kent would have sprung up is the fact that one of the things that the people over on Kent Island like to point out to you is the fact that the Virginians were there, and Kent County, Kent Island and the settlement there. And, if you sit down there and say, well, where was the first settlement in Maryland? Everybody says, St. Mary's City. The Virginians were up there on Kent Island, and at a little later time, Governor Leonard Calvert, the first governor and brother of the Lord Baltimore, Cecil, sent some troops over there to chase the rascals out. So you did have it was basically a trading post going north up here, Susquehanna Indians and so forth. So that's the reason why you would wind up with this pocket of settlement here, and that you would have the second county coming over there. After that, in 1650, you had Anne Arundel County, basically pretty much as it is today, with the exception of Howard County, which was cut off at a much later date. Then Collier County. Collier County is this brown bit right here. As you notice, it is not just what is today Collier on this peninsula between the Patuxent and the Chesapeake, but it was also on the west side of the Patuxent all the way up. Basically, it was the Patuxent Rivershed. And sometimes they will refer to it as Old Collier County because it was drastically altered at a later time. You had Charles County, which of course is on the Potomac side here above St. Mary's County. Followed after that in 1658, Baltimore County about 1659 the following year, and of course that included the city of Baltimore as well. That wasn't cut out until much later. Talbot County was the second one here on the eastern shore, and I emphasize that this coloration, this map, is geared into the time just before Prince George's County was started. This is not a current map of the counties because others were carved out of these spaces later on. Somerset County down below right here in 1666, and then in 69 Dorchester County right here. So everything was around the bay. There were and Cecil up here at the top of the bay was the other one. So there were 10 counties prior to Prince George's in 1696. We were the 11th county of the 23 we have today. We were also the last to be founded in the 17th century in line of succession. All right. As the population pressed further west, there was the desire on the people in this part of Charles County and in Calvert County to form a new county. And a petition was made to the General Assembly, and in 1695, in May, the act was passed by the Assembly. This explains, is one of the reasons, and in fact, in this publication that I have right here, it's Flags and Seals of Maryland and the United States. It lists Prince George's County as 1695. All right, the person who did the research on this did not read the act as such. Yes, the act was passed in 1695, but what does the act say? Let me just read a couple sentences out of it. It is hereby constituted, founded, and incorporated into a county of this province, and shall be denominated, called, and known by the name of Prince George's County, and shall from and after the 23rd day of April next ensuing, being St. George's Day, as aforesaid, have and enjoy all other rights, benefits, and privileges equal with all other counties of this province, such as sending burgesses to assemblies, having county courts, sheriff, justices, and other officers and ministers requisite and necessary, and is used in other counties of this province. So Prince George's County actually, I think of the 23, is the only one which actually has a specific date set as a birthday. And why did they do this? It was simply a matter whereby they had to go out and survey the new boundary line. They had to line up the people to run the government, the justices, the commander, the military commander of the county, and so forth. So it was May, they passed the act, and they figured they could get all this together, and the following year on St. George's Day, the county would be put into operation. So that's why sometimes you see that 1695 date, but that is not the date. It is actually April 23rd, 1696 for the county. To clear up one thing, the question that our president mentioned earlier about the dragon, said something about a dragon. Did I understand you?
That's correct.
All right. What is the significance of St. George's Day? St. George's Day is the patron saint's day of England. Who was St. George? St. George was an early Christian, about 8th, 9th century. He lived in Asia Minor and was an early martyr to the cause of Christianity. And as time went on, the lore, the story of the things that he had done and so forth, he became associated with this dragon legend. I mean, in effect, what it boils down to is it's a situation of good triumphing over evil, the dragon representing evil. All right. How did a saint who originated, who lived in Asia Minor, get back to England? He'd never been there before. How did these two things get together? Well, during the time of the Crusades, many of them traveled by land and would have passed through Asia Minor on the way to the Holy Land. And many of the English who came back, especially at the time of, I believe, Richard II. Returned, and they had heard of this particular story, and it was a fascinating one, and it was something that over a period of time which was gradually adapted. In the case of the Crusaders, any wearing armor or what have you, the over covered cloth tunic, white one covering any mail or other type of armor that they may have been wearing, was decorated with the Red Cross, which was the symbol of St. George that had been adopted on a local basis. And this is where we wind up with the flag with the cross of St. George. In the act which was passed, that was the flag that was designated for the county. It did not have the seal in the corner, just the cross. Incidentally, on the earlier counties, they also had flags designated at the time of their origin, but they were of a solid color. Talbot County, for instance, today is a carryover from that. It is purple in color. St. Mary's carries over today. It has the state seal, the coat of arms in the center of it, but it is a red, rich red flag of about that particular shade. There was an orange one. There was a white one. I can imagine the county having as their county flag, white flag is the symbol of surrender, but that is what's the situation. There was a green one. This was the first one that had any sort of design to it. That flag lasted right up until, was used right up until in the 1950s, and because of many other organizations, many other uses of the flag, and so forth, the commissioners passed a resolution placing what was the original county seal in the upper left-hand field there in order to definitely designate it, to distinguish it from others. For instance, if you travel in Canada today, you'll also see it in England in the case of a flagpole on church property. If it's Church of England, it's the white flag with the red cross on it. It's also the Navy ensign of the British Navy, who is also used as the original English national flag. As such, it's the beginning of the Union Jack. I'm going to walk out of your field for a moment. Beginning of the Union Jack here. Add to this with the act of bringing in Ireland and Scotland, the Scottish flag, the blue flag with the white X cross, St. Andrew's cross on it. Let's put the blue there and then the red on top of that, and then throw in the flag, the Irish, the red X cross for St. Patrick on there, and superimpose the three of them, and you had the Union Jack. And that's how it came about. But that is used as a Navy ensign as well today. There are a lot of patriotic organizations in the United States, like the Society of the Colonial Wars, which have that, and then a seal superimposed in the center of the cross. So there are a lot of variations on it, but it is actually very close to what it was at the time of the founding in 1696. Now, one other thing, people say St. George's Day, Prince George's County, they get the two confused. All right, who was Prince George? Prince George was one of the younger siblings of the Danish royal family. He was Prince George of Denmark. And he married one of his younger siblings in the British royal family. And the big sister, along with her husband, were the joint monarchs. He came on the throne after the Glorious Revolution in 1689. William died, and then Mary, William and Mary, they reigned jointly, each in their own right. And then when they died, there were no children there, and Anne, who was the younger sister, became queen, and then Prince George became the Prince Consort. He was the Prince Philip of his day, to put it in the context of today. So they were both younger siblings of the two royal families. And of course, after Queen Anne's death, their offspring did not live to maturity, and of course, you brought into the German line, Diamondback, so forth, is the last of the Stuart line in England. So these are the two persons we're talking about. All right, in the case of Prince George's County, the bulk of the population was in the valley here. In fact, let me show you the next map. This particular map is one that was done by a member of our society. This is Louise Height, who wrote a book called Prince George's Heritage. It's one of the good references on the county, Prince George's County up until 1800. This map, Mrs. Heighton came to the Washington area with her husband, who worked at the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center just before World War II. And she was from out in was a DAR member, and she was actually from out in Indiana. And she said, oh, this is going to be great on history. Here's Maryland, Prince George, it goes all the way back to the 1600s, and there's going to be all this great information there. Well, she discovered that there, after she went to the public library, there's a lot of information here, but nothing had been pulled together into book form for the edification of the general public. So Mrs. Heighton was a very methodical individual, and she decided she was going to do something about that. When her husband Truman went on active duty during World War II, she said she wasn't going to sit around home all day and do nothing. So every Monday was her day in the Hall of Records in Annapolis. And the first thing that she did was to work on this map. This map took her 5 years to do it. The original of it, which is superimposed on a Prince George's County map, there are 4 sections to it, and it's about yay tall and about yay wide in actual size, where you can actually, it's a regular county map from the late 40s, where you have all the streets, the roads, the streams and everything, and you want to find the actual location of one of these patents, you can really tell it. This only gives you the general idea because it's a line drawing. But what she did, she sat down and read the patent books. Now, what are the patent books? When Lord Baltimore conveyed a piece of land to you, it was recorded in the patent books. Those were his business books. That deed, that patent was also, at the same time, you took it out and it was recorded in the county land library. One was for public purposes, the other was for private purposes, because even though you owned the property, there was still a matter of a little tribute twice a year to Lord Baltimore in the form usually of a minimum of a couple shillings. And this was his, he not only sold the land originally, but he got a little state income as time went on. So he kept his own set of books. And that was a good thing, because in the case of St. Mary's County, they've had basically our records in the state are superior to many of the states as far as suffering from fires, destruction during the Civil War in many of the southern states and so forth, and other damage or just being thrown out in some situations. St. Mary's County was plagued by some courthouse fires, as was Collier County, two of the oldest county, the oldest and almost the next to the oldest county in the state. All right, you can piece your land chain of ownership together in those two counties or any other location from those patent books, because as far as the original grant is concerned, now after you got the property, if you went out and sold it later on, it stayed, I mean, it went into the county land libraries, but it did not show in his books. So you can actually pick it up at that particular time on these counties and take it forward. All right, it showed then from this, she went into the patent books and picked out all of these patents, and on the descriptions, most of them start at a moundered oak tree. that old tree has fallen down, was chopped down for firewood, 200 years ago or longer, or a rock. In some situations where you were on a particular stream, right on that stream bank or some other prominent landmark, you can zero right in. And of course, at this time, the county was not thickly populated. So in order to sit down there and piece all these together, really, that's the reason why it took her 5 years. And what she did, these that are shaded are on the east side of the county, which is the Patuxent Valley. This was what was a part of Old Collier County. The ones that are not shaded on the Potomac side, on the west side, were originally a part of Collier County. And what they did, they drew a line here for the southern boundary. They drew a line across here. I mean, they put Collier back on the east side of the Patuxent River, and they drew a line down at approximately this particular point, and came up with Prince George's County, and then said that it was everything to the west. And if you're doing research at any time, whether it's here in Maryland or anywhere else, as good friend Karen Miles, who was president of the County Genealogical Society, can tell you, before you go out looking for genealogy in public records, you better know your genealogy of the civil jurisdictions within that state in which you're operating, because I get letters all the time that are sent to me from the people over at Prince Frederick from the Collier County Historical Society, because here's somebody from California writing to you saying that their ancestor was in Collier County in 1670. That's true, but that property is now in Prince George's County. I mean, when you're just by knowing the name and so forth, many of those requests wind up being in Prince George, so it gets sent over to me, and then I pick it up from that particular point. So you can spend a lot of time running around trying to find out something where if you knew what the actual origin of the areas were. Now you see, this is in 1692, and you see the 10 counties. Prince George's is not here. We have 23 today, plus the city of Baltimore, but they don't even appear. Or you're researching something going back to this particular time, and you knew that they lived in a particular area, you say, oh, that's in Frederick County today. But at the particular time, you see, it was in another county. So it saves a lot of time doing it that particular way. All right, so Swanson's Creek, which is just below Aquasco, coming from the Patuxent, was the southern boundary coming in from the Patuxent, and Mattawoman Creek coming in from the Potomac on the west side of the county up to their headwaters, and then there was a straight line drawn between the two. That was the original southern boundary of the county, and then, as I said, everything to the west. All right, stayed that way until 1748. What was happening in the meantime? In the 1700s, you had people going west. More economic opportunity, those younger siblings. There's not enough on that local farm that they had, so they're going west to pick up better economic opportunities. You had many Germans coming into Philadelphia who were going west and then coming down the Monocacy and the Hagerstown, the valleys there, Hagerstown and so forth, and you got this pocket of primarily German population out there around Frederick. So in 1748, Frederick County was cut off. The Frederick County boundary is what is today the Prince George's Montgomery boundary. So between 1696, I mean, if you had a piece of property, for instance, where the city, say where the city of Washington is today, prior to 1696, when Prince George's was founded, it could be found in the Charles County Libraries. After 1696, up until 1748, if it were purchased, you know, or patented in that period of time, you would find it in the Prince George's Libraries. I mean, there's property all the way out in the Cumberland area, which appears in the Prince George's Libraries prior to 1748. After 1748, everything to the west is Frederick County. Then, in 1776, right at the beginning of the war, the population had increased so much, and especially what is today Frederick's County. And what they did, in effect, they just sort of drew almost like a parallel, two parallel lines across here, and Frederick became what was the center section where the city of Frederick is. That piece of land between Frederick and Prince George's was Montgomery County, and then from on the west side, everything to the west, Washington County. Appropriate names for the time. 1775 at Christmas, just before that, General Richard Montgomery was killed while trying to storm the gates of Quebec, trying to get the Canadians in on the American side before the revolution actually started. He was a war hero. And of course, Washington had just taken command as in command of the Continental Forces, so logically, Washington County there to the west. Then later on, in the 1790s, it was cut off again with Cumberland as the county seat. We throw in Allegheny, and then finally, after the Civil War, Garrett County. Garrett County, who was that named after? John?
Garrett.
Garrett. What was his fame?
Railroads.
Beg pardon?
Railroads.
Right, he was the president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And he's the guy with his railroad who actually kept the Union Army going for most of the Civil War. I mean, if Robert Garrett had been of any other mind, as far as the politics of the Civil War is concerned, they would have had a heck of a time moving troops and material from the north into the southern battle zones. He actually held the Union together with that particular railroad. So that's how it got chopped up to the west. All right, at 1748, there was one other change in the boundary besides cutting off everything to the west. That little slice of land down there, Mattawoman Creek, a little peninsula in there, that was returned to Charles County. That was returned to Charles County. And the only other boundary change we had came about when with the adoption, or right after the adoption of the federal Constitution. The Constitution makes provisions for a federal city. It's something we read about every once in a while today in the papers on the matter of representation in Congress or what have you. But of course, the federal city was something that everybody wanted at that time. It was like the new railroad that they were going to build into a new territory, or the new college, or the new this or that. And in this particular situation, it was agreed that it was going to be the compromise that they would go along with it being on the Potomac River. And of course, everywhere from practically from down here at Point Lookout all the way up to Williamsport, were interested in this federal city. All right, Washington, when he became president, was inaugurated in '89, set the wheels into motion as far as the picking of the site was concerned. The agreement was signed, and the Congress passed an act, and in 1791, either 91 or 92, the General Assembly of Maryland passed an act ceding what was the Maryland portion of the District of Columbia to the federal government. But there was one kicker involved. They said, yes, have jurisdiction of that portion of mostly Prince George's and part of Montgomery County. However, we want to see the color of your money. In other words, as soon as Congress arrives in town, Nixon was representative of the government, that is when this act goes fully into effect. That's when you actually get control. So it was in December of 1800, Congress had its first meeting in Washington, that the District of Columbia officially was no longer a part of the city of Washington. If you want to track properties in Washington in that period of the 90s, they still appear in the Prince George's or the Montgomery Land Libraries, depending on what party of the city it was in. Basically, the mouth of setting the boundary between Prince George's and Montgomery, the old Frederick County boundary, it was drawn from a point on the Patuxent at Seth Hyatt's Mill, which is just west of Laurel, to the mouth of Rock Creek. It was a straight line. So Georgetown and everything basically to the west of Rock Creek was Montgomery County. So if you want to check any properties in there up through the 1700s, up to 1800, they would be in the Prince George's libraries. People, the early land speculators in the area that became Washington, set up a couple of real estate developments. You've heard of Carrollsburg, and you've also heard of Hamburg. Well, if you look in the Prince George's library, they didn't draw up separate plats on that, but get the big library, the land record book that has the deeds recorded in it, very beautifully drawn by hand, and over a double page in the library you will see the land plat with all the lot numbers and so forth for both Carrollsburg and Hamburg in the city of Washington. Hamburg basically is down around the State Department, Foggy Bottom. Carrollsburg is where Fort McNair is, the peninsula between the Potomac and the Anacostia Rivers. Those are the two particular areas. So that's how the county came about as far as its present boundaries are concerned. Just a couple more comments. I think those chairs are probably getting a little hard there, but we'll take a break. So on the 23rd of April, all the preliminaries had been completed, all the county officials had been appointed, and the justices met in what was the church at the village of Charlestown on a patent known as Mount Colvard. The name Charlestown has long since disappeared. The name Mount Colvard still exists. It primarily exists because the name is held by an early house which is still on that particular property. It's situated there, the beautiful view there at the confluence of the western branch of the Patuxent and the main body of the Patuxent, just southeast of Marlboro. They met there at the church, which was the forerunner of St. Paul's Church at Dayton today, and had the first meeting of the county court there. You had justices, and these justices not only took care of civil matters, but they also took care of legal matters as well. And they handle everything. They decide the tax rate, and they decide whether somebody should go to jail or not for some infringement of criminal law, and they also decide what the tax rate and other such things as that. It wasn't until life became more complicated in the period after the Revolution that you had justices that were strictly legal, and these other justices later evolved in the early 1800s into a board of 5 county commissioners, who then in turn in the 1960s evolved into our county council and executive and all the other appended bureaucracy which we have in the county today. With within a year, they had a courthouse there, and the county government sat there for 25 years, but it was in a backwater. It was off the main transportation stem at that particular time, and after 25 years, the county court was moved, the county seat was moved up to Balmer, where it has been ever since. Basically, our county, over a period of time, has been affected by a lot of things, and let me just mention the titles of these topics, and I'll say a couple words about them later on after our break. When you look at a particular city or an area today, you go back and say, well, gee, how come? Why is this thing here today? As I mentioned, the possibility of a major bridge or a ferry or an industry. Actually, industry has played very little in the development of Prince George's County. We only have one location in Prince George's County which can be tied in with industry. Where is it? Laurel, the city of Laurel. That's the only early spot in the county which was tied in with the cotton mills. It's on the fall line. They had a dam with a mill there. Only industry in the county that had any major effect upon the development of the county in the earlier years. The rest of it, basically an agricultural economy, and if anything had a major effect upon the development of the county over the entire 296-year period of time, it would be transportation in the form of roads and railroads, and it would be that monster called government. Those two things, transportation and government, changed us from an agricultural and agrarian economy to a suburbia, and then just finally the whole thing went away with government, the growth of government, the growth of transportation. I've been talking for an hour at the present time.
I think we're making a motion.
One comment before making my last remarks for the evening. I pointed out to you earlier Prince George's Heritage by Mrs. Heighton. Another book which was published by the Historical Society, by the County Historical Society back in '76, now out of print, but there are quite a few copies around in depositories. There's one called Out of the Past, Prince Georgians and Their Land by Judge R. Lee Van Horn. This is an unusual book. It's sort of a genealogist gold mine because it has about 50 or 60 pages of names in the index. And basically what Judge Van Horn did was to go through all of the public records and newspapers and everything else from the beginning up through the beginning of the Civil War, and anything that had anything to do with Prince George's County, he just put it in here in sort of chronological order with a comment or two in between. And it's full of trivia, but that's where the names are and the little bits of history. I mean, there's material in here that you wouldn't find in any other published history or about any other county in the United States. So it's very unusual in that respect. We republished the Hopkins Atlas of 1878, which is done by election districts, and this is in print at the present time and available. It is indexed. It has, the interesting thing about it is that not only does it have the geographical features, but it also has the property holders along the map, and you can look in the index if you're looking for anyone in particular. The most recent thing published, the first edition was put out about 8 years ago, and this one came out last year, Prince George's County, a Pictorial History by Alan Verda. Old photographs of the county from the beginning up to the present time, and with written text as well. Very interesting, and the the only written document that covers the county from the beginning right to the present time. This is in print and is available. The other thing that is, the only other thing that's been written by the written on the county that has a non-specialty book, so as to speak, is Effie Gwynn Bowie's book. I forget my Across the Years in Prince George's County. Sit down here and forget my own name. Across the Years in Prince George's County. Basically, it's genealogy on most of the basic families in Prince George's County from the beginning up through the earlier part, well, actually up through the time of World War II. But even though it's genealogy, it also has, I'll hold it up here to see it. Even though it's genealogy, it has a lot of good historical material in it. And for a lot of researchers, I'm sure there are a lot of other counties in which they had a similar type of book on their area as a quick reference on people and what they did. It's not a book of genealogical charts. It has a lot of good information. So those are the basic general references as far as the county is concerned. There's been a lot of detailed histories, books put out on towns and on particular topics. And we've had quite a few come out in recent years, which is very encouraging in that particular area. And one other thing, the library here is open every Saturday from noon until 4, and anyone is year-round. Anyone is welcome to use it, stop over and talk to you at any time. Quiet be here. On a couple of occasions, our good friend Warren Rhodes over there by the door has substituted for me. I think I've missed about 5 or 6 Saturdays out of the past 6.5 years, so I have a pretty good attendance record of being here. I said before the break that basically we were talking about an agricultural economy in Prince George's County, which revolved around primarily the production of tobacco. Tobacco was the staple of southern Maryland, and believe it or not, tobacco was also raised on the eastern shore. But they diversified very early after the period of the Revolution and got into grains and vegetable crops, and of course eventually became a major center of the canning industry in the 19th and the early part of the 20th century. They made an early change. At the present time, basically, Prince George's County real estate has driven out tobacco as far as we're raising houses rather than raising a particular crop. Tobacco was the medium of exchange. If you see something referred to in documents here in the county or in southern Maryland in early period, even into the 19th century, referred to something as being at a value of 100 pounds. It's possible that they're still carrying forward on the English monetary system, but the other great possibility that they're talking about pounds of tobacco. Well, one comment before finishing off the matter of economy, I'd like to make a couple of comments about religion, because I alluded to it earlier as far as Maryland being a Catholic colony. Here in Prince George's County, actually on a formal basis, the Anglican Church, its successor today, the Episcopal Church, would have been the first organized group per se really flourishing in the county. In 1692, when for a short period of time, it was a carryover from the Glorious Revolution in England, the control of Maryland was taken away from still held it as real estate. He still collected his money coming to him, but he did not have control of the government. So he not only owned the property, but he also had the governmental control. The governors were appointed by him, not by the crown. All right, from 1689 until 1713, when Charles Lord Baltimore died, and his the next one succeeded him, became a Protestant for practical purposes. He got back, regained control of his property, his province, as far as the governmental end of the line was concerned. So in that period of time, you had well-appointed governors in Maryland, and one of the charges to Lionel Copley, who was said here as the first royal governor, was to bring about the establishment of religion, because they thought that things were somewhat on the heathen side here, and a lot of good church people were saying that you really aren't providing for our needs in this area of religion. And in 1692, the Act of Establishment was passed. That map that I showed you earlier actually is out of a book that deals with the establishment of the church in Maryland. And drawn on here are the parish lines, because just like the counties, they divided the counties, divided these counties around the bay into 30 parishes under that act in 1692, and they became the state-supported church. It did not mean that everyone had to attend that church, but it meant that everyone, it's the same thing. You know, you can send your children to private school if you wish to, or parochial school, or what have you today, but you still pay the tax. It helps to run the Prince George's County school system. The same thing was true with the church. Those 30 original parishes are celebrating their 300th anniversary in this particular year. 2 of them are here in Prince George's County. They were actually, one was established originally as a part of Calvert, and the other was a part of Charles counties, but then as soon as the boundary was changed 4 years later, they were Prince George's County parishes. But under that particular Establishment Act, for the support of the clergy, 30 pounds of tobacco per poll per person. This tobacco was collected by the sheriff of the county. He went around and collected it, and he got his commission. I mean, actually, in the colonial period in Maryland, the most powerful job, the most sought-after job, was the position as sheriff. Because the sheriff, anytime he performed any function, he was not on salary, but whenever he performed a function, he got a fee. And that collecting the tobacco, which in turn was turned over to the clergyman of the parish, he got a fee for collecting that. And the interesting thing was, at that particular time, when you go around and look at some of these churches around in different locations, St. Barnabas right here in Leland, which was a chapel of St. Paul's Parish, the original one that was at Mount Calvert, later moved to Dayton, further down in the county. St. Barnabas down here is right out in the middle of nowhere, yet it was one of the most sought-after jobs, parishes, as far as the clergy were concerned in Maryland. It was like, a parish in Chevy Chase rather than in the inner city, as far as what the clergyman might get in the salary. All right, what was an uptown parish? What was the criteria that made this come about? 2 things. Number one, the quality of the tobacco grown in that parish. Because the better the tobacco, the better price you got for it. So you could have a beautiful church building, but then they had lousy tobacco land where that was located. You didn't get a very good salary. You could have a very nice house, nice rectory to live in, but still that did not affect his salary. All right, the other thing which determined whether it was one of the better sought-after parishes or not, was the number of members of the faith who lived within your parish boundaries. If you were in a parish where you had a lot of Catholics, a lot of Presbyterians in your parish, when the sheriff came around to get his 30 pounds of tobacco per person, and you were a Catholic or a Presbyterian, you gave him 30 pounds of the junk. You didn't bring his, you gave him the worst of the crop. And when you go out today with your tobacco, and after they cut it and dry it on the stalk, then in the winter months before the auction, they sit down and they strip it, and it's graded out, and then the best is put together. That brings one price. And so, well, I say, if you weren't one of the faithful, you gave him the junk, and he got less money. So if you had a lot of non-members of the faith in your parish, you weren't going to get as much money. So that was one of the things. And St. Barnabas here had a lot of good members of faith living within the geographical confines of that parish, and they also had the best tobacco land around. So it was a very sought-after position. Why would a clergyman at St. Anne's Church in Annapolis, which was in the city, the Athens of Maryland, and what have you, the governor attended there in the assembly, and so why should he leave Annapolis and come out here to the sticks? More money. So one of the little sidelines of the economic scene at that particular time. With the establishment of the church in the Anglican Church in Maryland, the other Protestant groups were permitted to worship, continue in their own ways. But in the period 1701 through the time of the Revolution, the Catholic Church was not permitted to hold public worship. And basically, your two oldest Catholic church establishments in Prince George's County, which date from the 18th century, are actually outgrowths of what were private chapels. The oldest one in the county, in fact one of the oldest in the state, is White Marsh, Sacred Heart Church here, White Marsh, on the edge of Bowie, just before you get to 301. That property was inherited by the Jesuit order, which basically staffed all of the Catholic missions in America in the colonial period, and they had their own private chapel there. And it, of course, evolved in the parish that you have today. The other one, Boone's Chapel, down south of Marlborough, was the other private chapel. That was an actual family chapel, and the beginnings of the church in Marlborough, and of course the present church of the Most Holy Rosary in Rosaryville, were the continuation of that particular church. The Presbyterians had a very early start in Prince George's County, primarily because many of the factors, merchants, representatives of British firms trading here in America were of Scottish origin, hence the beginnings of the Presbyterian Church in the county. The church at Marlborough was founded in the first decade of the 18th century, and the church at Bladensburg, the other earlier one, was just a few years after that, in the second decade. The Marlborough Church became extinct. The property where it was located, the burying ground, became what is now Trinity Episcopal Church in Upper Marlborough, about 1815 or 1810, along in that period. And the church at Bladensburg made several moves within the village, and then up across the eastern branch, the northeastern branch of the Anacostia into the Hyattsville area, and is what is its successor today, direct line, is the Hyattsville Presbyterian Church, which is located over near Prince George's plaza at the present time. Also, you had very early Methodist beginnings here in the county. The first Methodist meetings were actually held at a farm, the name of the place is called Wildcat, up there where the Beltway crosses Kenilworth Avenue at Greenbelt. Shadrach Turner was the original pioneer Methodist here in the county, and that was the early beginnings there. Basically, most of your other groups in the county are much later. Just the other four groups were here, in number and, major parts of the community up through the time, actually up into the 20th century. As far as the church was concerned, there were two locals, but one from Upper Marlboro, the other from the Marlboro area over near Croom, who had a great deal to do with the early organization of their denominations here in America. John Carroll was believed to have been born in the house which we know today as Darla's Chance in Upper Marlboro. Of course, he became the first Roman Catholic bishop in the United States as Bishop of Baltimore, later Archbishop of Baltimore. His contemporary, Thomas John Claggett of Croom, was an Episcopal clergyman, and he was elected as the first Episcopal bishop of Maryland, and was the first bishop of that denomination consecrated here in America. So the organization of those two churches very much revolved around Maryland, and they were both native Prince Georgians, and were friends and neighbors in many ways. Warfare had some effect upon the county over history. People passed through and a lot served during the Revolution, but it wasn't until the War of 1812 that Prince George's enjoyed, they experienced an experience that was had by very few people in the United States at any time in history, that is, being invaded by a foreign power. We had a civil war, but that was a famine thing. But when you consider it, other than the action up in the Detroit area and here in Maryland, Baltimore, and in Prince George's County, we haven't been invaded by any foreigners. Mexican War, we were actually the foreigners, moving into the foreign country, and then took over the area that we had squatted in. So in that particular situation, we did have the war at our doorstep, and passed through going in both directions. And of course, you had the battle at Bladensburg, which was a bit of an embarrassment to the United States. I won't go into that in detail, but of course, the most interesting outcome of that was the story of Dr. Beans being taken prisoner in Upper Marlboro by the British, and of course the efforts on the part of Francis Scott Key to get him released by the British Navy, and of course being in Baltimore, the Baltimore Harbor, aboard a British warship at the time of the battle, or the shelling of Fort McHenry, and the writing of our national anthem at that particular time. In the economic field, the tobacco economy enjoyed a very healthy life prior to the time of the Revolution in the 18th century. You had the national economic slump during the Revolution and immediately afterwards. Some of that economic slump was due to local conditions, but a lot of it was due to the fact that although we were not engaged in war. There were many little battles going on amongst the powers on the European continent from the time of the end of our revolution up until 1815. Of course, we got the last part of that, the War of 1812, but with the French and the British back and forth, it meant that the shipping of our products overseas ran into a great deal of difficulty. So it wasn't until after the War of 1812 that the economy began to come back into its own, and it was in a fairly good condition, a golden age of the tobacco economy prior to the time of the Civil War. With the end of the Civil War, you not only had the death of slavery, which put an end to that particular labor market, but you also had another thing. The Civil War was very much like Second World War, in that a great number of people who hadn't been any farther than their farm or a couple of blocks from home were suddenly uprooted and went off to strange places within the United States to fight the battles. The entire population was uprooted. And as a result, the horizons were widened for a great number of people. A lot of people returned to areas, may have been from Maryland and fought in a part of the Western campaign or the old Southwest Western campaign, and then after the war is over, went back to that area and sought out economic opportunity there. It started the population on the move. It was a prelude to the mass westward movement. Just as after World War II, we became a very fluid population. It's still going full tilt. So those two factors had a great deal of effect upon Prince George's County, in that a great number of the people left the county, went up to the city. The ones who didn't go, some left and went west. I had relatives who left lower Prince George's, Charles County, and went by a wagon train out to Iowa immediately at the end of the Civil War. As an example, people came into the city of Washington. You look into early city directories, or you go over and look in Congressional Cemetery over in southeast Washington, not too far from the Navy Yard. You go through there, and if you looked at Maryland names and genealogy or anything like that, there's an awful lot of St. Mary's, Colbert, Charles, and Prince George's names there in that Congressional Cemetery, because they came up into the nearest part, the southeast section of Washington. A lot of them had initially had contact with the city, bringing in vegetables and other more marketable crops into the city market for sale, and a lot of them wound up staying in the city. So that happened, number one. Number two, you had land in the immediate vicinity, contiguous to the city of Washington, to the district, which, because of the lack of labor, came on the market for potential development. You had the railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, which came first from Baltimore into Washington. Of course, it went from Baltimore going to the west. 1827 they were founded, but in 1835 the Washington branch was opened. All right, anything along that particular rail line running into Washington here in the county was fair game for the possibility of development, because there was an easy way to get into the city. So actually the first real estate brochure prospectus that I've seen was for a place called the Highlands. It is the area that is actually what is today Cottage City, and that was published in 1870. That was the first one that I could determine into that corridor where they began to try to sell property, and then you had just going on out. Hyattsville was incorporated in 1886, but it was around before that. But Hyattsville basically was peopled by some professionals and government clerks, people coming in from other part of the country. It used to be that employment in the federal government, those jobs had to be distributed around on the basis of where you came from by state. You realize that? I mean, you just didn't go down there and if they needed 100 new clerks in the War Department, something like that, they couldn't sit down and hire 100 dyed-in-the-wool Maryland Prince Georgians to fill those jobs. I mean, they were allocated out as to where you were from originally. So a lot of people, your earliest outside population, coming from west, coming back this way, came in with the expansion of the government after the Civil War. And Hyattsville is a perfect example of that. I mean, for instance, during the Civil War, in the election, all the candidates that were running for president, there were 3 Democrats and 1 Republican. Abraham Lincoln got 1 vote for president in Prince George's County. That was down in the Quasco district. And I once heard someone comment, they're probably still looking for that razzle to find out who it was who may have voted for him at that particular time, although it later became a Republican stronghold within the county. But in that particular situation, though, with this matter of the people coming in from other areas, in Hyattsville, you had a great number of people from other areas that came in there, and the point that I wanted to make is that all of the people in Prince George's County, the bulk of them, were relatively neutral, trying to ride the fence, or they were Southern leaning. There were very few people from Prince George's County who served in the Union Army. And the thing that will tip you off in looking through history or what have you is the fact that following the Civil War, there were several United Confederate Veterans, the equivalent of the GAR, which was the Union Veterans Organization. There were several of them in Prince George's County. There was one in Prince George's County that fell in the GAR column. It was located in Hyattsville. It was founded in 1890. The Civil War is over in 1865. So what does that tell you? And then you sit down there and see a list of the members of that post. None of those names, there's one name in that list that I remembered that actually was a Prince George's County name. And basically when people working from Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and so forth, here, settled in Hyattsville, working in the government, and they founded the GAR post. It only lasted for about 10 years, but they were not from the area locally. Laurel, you had the cotton mill, but in the post-Civil War period, you had both professionals, lawyers, and other professionals living there. And Laurel was in a very beneficial situation in that they are halfway in between Baltimore and Washington. And something that, are any of you from Laurel? Right. I don't know if you've noticed this yet or not, but if you're there in Laurel, you're talking to a real native, what have you, and they say, gee, I'm going to town tomorrow. You want me to pick anything up for you from the store or anything like that? You have to know that person personally to know whether or not town is Baltimore or town is Washington. Do they read the Baltimore Sun, or do they used to read the Washington Star, now the Washington Post? See which way they go. The same thing is true in the orientation in South County and in Charles, St. Mary's, Collier County, Anne Arundel. Do they read most of them read the Sun, or a good percentage read the Sun. The Washington papers began to permeate a little bit more, but basically the Sun. I once asked Orlando Rideout, who's from Annapolis, but he lives out at St. Margaret's on the way at Whitehall on the way over the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, and I said, Lanny, I saw such and so about something that he was interested in the Post. Did you see it? And he says, at the Post, he says, that newspaper isn't delivered out here, on that neck of land running from, between the Severn and the Patapsco up to Baltimore. The Washington Post doesn't get out there. They don't look at it, you see. So you have to know what the geographical tie-in is. The Southern Maryland tie-in with Baltimore is based on two things. Originally, the steamboats came out of Baltimore, and all the people came in or went out, or all their produce or their oysters or other things went to the Baltimore markets. And all your shopping things came down from Baltimore on the steamboats. You sold cattle, they were put on the steamboats and taken to Baltimore. And then after that, when you got the Baltimore and Potomac, later Pennsylvania, now Amtrak coming down, and then the Pope's Creek line running from Bowie on down through Marlboro and so forth, that took over for the steamboat again into Baltimore. Crane Highway was built into Southern Maryland, and the trucks took the tobacco and everything to Baltimore and back again. So, and the other tie-in was the fact that Baltimore was a large commercial industrial center, and it had services, and Washington basically was a government town, and it did not have the services, goods, etc. available that the city of Baltimore has, so that your orientation went in that direction, and there are a lot of people that have that same orientation today as a result of that historical background. So this land was available. You had the transportation, which was bringing about the early beginnings of suburbia in the late 1800s. You had the coming of the streetcars. At the turn of the century, 1901, the streetcar got from Washington all the way out to Laurel. And that was another method of ferrying the people into town. This railroad line was another one. In the period up through the World War I and into the 20s, you had the WB&A, Washington, Baltimore, Annapolis Electric Railroad, which actually carried more passengers than did the regular rail lines, the regular rail lines, B&O and Pennsy, in that period of time until the Depression period caused it to go out of business. And this helped to bring on suburbia. The suburbia continued on. It was slightly held back by the Depression, and then in the 30s it picked up again, and of course after World War II it took off. World War II brought the expansion of government, and of course it did not become deflated after the war was over. It kept on ongoing, which meant the need for more people, and they kept coming in to the particular area. And actually the thing which, in my estimation, as far as county history is concerned, that was the watershed, the turning point, as far as the history of the county is concerned, when agriculture was no longer, tobacco was no longer the major force as far as the county is concerned. It came about as a result of transportation. Was that about 25 years ago? It's something called the Beltway. The Beltway was the end of the tobacco economy in Prince George's County, and suburbia went out. The Beltway, because the Beltway, in theory, ferry people around the city to get south to go elsewhere and so forth. No, it was just something to make the real estate development continue on. But that was actually the watershed. I mean, that you could use as the transfer from one into the other. I'm going to
You mentioned a lot about the, shall we call them, immigrants to the Prince George's County, but precious little on the natives in the area. And I look particularly to someone that I know
The
of.
background on the natives?
Yes, the Turkey Teac, for instance. And
On the Indians?
yes.
Of course, the problem, well, I'll tell a little story out of school. Warren Rhodes will appreciate that, and our president will appreciate it. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm interested in most any subject as far as Prince George's, Maryland history in general is concerned, but there are two subjects which I don't dislike or don't disrespect them or what have you, but I don't like to waste my time on them. And I'll explain to you why after I tell you what they are. Number one is ghosts, and the other one is Indians. And the reason why I have this dislike is that every year when Halloween rolls around, every damn reporter in every weekly paper or other thing along the line, and the school teachers also tell the kiddies, you sit down and find out something about ghosts and write a paper. And then those telephone calls come in at about 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, because the weeklies that publish on Thursday, about 4 o'clock is their deadline on Tuesday. And you get this character on the phone, you're busy at the office, and right away they want first pair, they want their story. I say, well, look, let me go check over my files over at the library. Oh, my deadline's a half hour from now. I said, I'm sorry, goodbye. And then when Thanksgiving comes around, Thanksgiving, there were the Pilgrims and there were the Indians. You see that stereotype, and you get that Indian then. All right, and so those two subjects sort of shake me up a little bit. And both of them are somewhat on the ethereal line. I mean, ghosts aren't something you can actually reach out and grab a hold of or take pictures of and so forth. I mean, a lot of it is folklore or one's imagination. When the wind's blowing and you hear this noise and you live in one of these old creepy houses, you think you've got a ghost. I know it's just the noise coming through the window. Unfortunately, as far as Indian history is concerned, especially in the very early period on the coast here, more so than some of the Plains Indians, and especially in the case of the Pueblo Indians, where they were somewhat static, their location, your Indian social structure did not provide for any great degree of record keeping. So a lot of this is based upon either archaeology or, again, stories that are passed on. So it's, there's not a whole lot of meat there really to seize upon. The funny that I want to tell you in conjunction with this is that when we published Alan Verda's second volume or reissue of his first book there, Alan was back, he's out at Boise State University in Idaho at the present time. This was summer, I guess, a year ago, and he was back in town, and our president arranged a meeting with the editor of the Prince George's Journal. Going to take Alan over there to introduce him, give him a couple of copies of the book for the paper to use as reference, and so forth. A nice little social visit. Our president took our treasurer along, and our past president, Warren Rhodes, who was back here somewhere, and they went over there. I was supposed to be there, but I couldn't get away from the office, and they went in there, they sat down, and Bud introduced everyone to the editor of the newspaper, and then he also said, and Fred DeMarr, our librarian and so forth, was supposed to be here, we couldn't make it over there, and the editor spoke up. He says, yes, he says, I know who he is. He says, I remember about 16 years ago or what have you, I just arrived in the area from New York, And I called him up on a Tuesday afternoon and wanted some information on ghosts in Prince George's. He sounded very cross. And the funny thing was is that Alan Verda and Warren Rhodes knew what my feeling was about ghosts, and they laughed. I don't believe that Jack and Bud, you know, it was sort of an in-joke amongst them, actually knew why the laughter on the particular subject. But the Indians certainly were present here. You had that archaeological work which was done by the Fergusons down there on their farm, which is next to the National Colonial Farm, next to the Piscataway, part of Piscataway National Park. And but basically it was relatively early in the game that they moved out. The Indians moved out of the area. And one thing that success that Maryland had that Virginia did not have, Maryland actually did not have any problems with the Indians to speak of. Very little. Jamestown had lots of problems with the Indians, and there were other places, the massacre there at Henrico, for instance, very early on. I mean, they had the problems in Massachusetts, for instance. Maryland did not have that problem. I mean, they had a stockaded fort at Jamestown for a reason. They built one initially at St. Mary's, but they had no use for it. And you didn't have a clustered city. I mean, St. Mary's City is a misnomer because everything was spread out. Because there was no reason to pull together in that city for protection. As far as the people who came later on, you know, the early settlers and so forth, basically English, a lot of Scots. You had an infusion of French Huguenots. That's my family, both sides were French Huguenots. And then, of course, a little later on, some Germans. More later on than the early period. And had a sprinkling of a few others, but not in any major quantity. Basically, they were English and Scottish here in the county, as evidenced by the meetings. That was a long-winded answer, but it covered a lot of elements. Anything else?
Telegraph Road. How's it got a road named Telegraph Road?
That's a short one today.
And of course that name has been turned around a little bit. I mean,
The street's been turned around.
the street's been was partially turned around, and they also changed the name from one road to another road. You know, when they went through this hassle on Palmer Highway down here, a couple of years ago, and so where I came up with the change to Martin Luther King Boulevard Highway.
Highway.
Is it Martin Luther King
Sure.
Highway?
Highway.
Okay. When they changed that over, I came up with a bright idea along the line what I thought they ought to do, because people are very much prone to this today. I think we ought to designate 4 fairly significant roads in the county that are up for grabs when we get a new board of a new county council and so forth, and they think that, you know, Fred DeMarr or the former Mayor Cheverly or somebody that was a great guy or a great gal or something like that. These 4 roads, you know, they can take whoever's name's on it now and put that name on it, you see, and then they can come along, like to appoint a member of a cabinet or a new agency head or something like that, but leave the others alone. And stop confusing the public. I mean, when they started on that one, and they backed off, and then they wanted to change Landover Road all the way from Bladensburg, where it starts, forks off Annapolis Road, all the way down to Marlboro. To all the way down. All right, it's Landover Road to Largo, and then it's Largo Road. Landover and Largo existed before Prince George's County was founded. There are two patents, Landover and Largo. And they got into a hassle out here in Bowie on Collington Road. Collington Road's been there since, the year one, and they got into a hassle, and he's going to name it after Ed Conroy. He was the state senator after he died. They got into a big flap on the thing, and they finally backed off on it. Interesting that you should ask that, Bud. I get a lot of questions like that, something that I'd hoped to do sometime, but the question is, where do you cut it off? Would be to come up with a, might start with just a booklet, but then you'd have to keep adding it or reissuing it or something like that. People, places, and things in the county, just tell you where the name came from and so forth. And hopefully in a lot of cases preserve some of these names that are getting lost.
I have a question. How do we impeach our county executive?
That's a political
That-
question.
Oh, that's a political
It's
question.
not
I'm sorry.
history.
What's that?
That's not ancient history, that's current, charter history.
I don't know what the charter has to say on that particular subject.
It's doable.
No, but something like that, people, places, and things, where do these names come from? And my greatest phobia in that particular area is where we go out and hang the route number and say, oh, he lives on 202 rather than Landover Road or Largo Road or 301 or 193. Let's project that up to the ridiculous end of the line. I mean, between that effort on the part, usually on the part of governmental agencies like the State Highway Administration, and then you throw in the U.S. Post Office Department and their zip codes, and throw in the Social Security Agency and maybe a little bit of parking planning on the side, Bud. And can you imagine me, somebody, suppose I live down on Landover Road, and this letter is addressed to 21622-2219. That's me, Social Security number. 3809 Route 202, and then 20763, if that's the zip,
85.
dash 3589. And they say, well, that simplifies because, our clerks that we have working there, they sit down there and remember Largo Road and Landover Road and Central Avenue and Norwich Road and all these things and so forth. But what happens if some character just hits, they're dealing with all these numbers, they just hit the wrong pedal on one of those numbers? It might go to Jack Bourne instead of me because his Social Security number is one number off on mine. Or it may wind up out in Western Maryland because, Route 301 and 321 or something like that. So, and very impersonal.
I have a question in regard to that map.
Yes.
I'm still thinking Warren. Is Marsham's Rest near Enterprise Road?
I'm not 100% sure where it's located, ma'am, to be perfectly frank. I don't think is it listed on
It's
that?
on that map.
I would have to actually sit down and take it apart and look at it.
Oh, I see. All right.
And try to figure out geographically.
Okay, I just thought you might know offhand.
No, I'm not absolutely sure.
All right.
I wanted to show you this. I didn't flip it out earlier. We reprinted this in blue, and it's hard to see. We don't have it in stock now, but there was this Xerox copy. It's black and white. See, this is a reproduction of Martinette's map of 1861. That's the first county map that was done. It too has the property owners and so forth on the map. The other interesting thing is these little insets. Here's downtown Piscataway, Laurel, Bladensburg, Upper Marlboro on it. But that'd be the first all-county map that was done Prince George's. That, then your next reference is this 1877 Hopkins Atlas, which came out, it was published in book form. The interesting thing, I don't know if you've ever seen one of those Hopkins Atlases before, but at that time, you know, it was a very ambitious thing, and you didn't have that much of a market around, considering the size of the population, who would be educated sufficiently to be interested in or want a map. And so as a result, I mean, could you sell enough to make it economically feasible to come out with it? So what they did, I mean, it's a folio size, like this in size. We just reduced it down. But what they did on the title page, it says Atlas of 15 miles around Washington, including the county of, and they say Prince George's, Maryland, and compiled, drawn by G.M. Hopkins Company, Philadelphia. All right. That map, that atlas has in it all of, has Prince George's, it has Montgomery, it has the District of Columbia, it has Loudoun, Fairfax, and Alexandria. And in the front of it, it has a couple, about 2 or 3 pages giving the history of the county, and then a chart of distances from like Marlborough to Hyattsville, this type of thing, and a list of subscribers, patrons, and small business card advertisements. All right, every one of these are the same, but the difference is on your title page on the front, you can get this with Montgomery, or you can have Fairfax, Virginia, or Loudoun, Virginia, or what have you. It's the same thing. And then on the inside, all the maps are the same, but in the front, on your historical pages, that depends upon which edition it is. So this way, they could create a larger market, make it economically feasible. It's the same thing. I don't know if they still do it or not, but during the 60s, I was in New York, teaching in the New York area. They're on the staff of a college in the New York area, and there on Time magazine, they had a New York edition, and what it was, 16 pages in the front of that rascal that was the same type of Time magazine talk, or what have you, but covering all of the gossip, everything economically, religion, politics on New York City. They were just trying to cater and build up the circulation in New York City.
Fred, there's a few more minutes. Might be interesting to see how many people have not been to Marietta before and give a few words about the history of Marietta.
Have any of you not been here before?
Everybody else has been here before.
This is is a part of a larger piece of property earlier known as Darnell's Grove, owned by Colonel Henry Darnell, and of course it was subsequently broken up, sold to other individuals, and was bought by a member of the Duvall family, and the person who was born on this property at a location down near where that new fire station is being built. Right down the road here is where the family home was located. The remains, the burying ground, are still there, and that person who was born there is Gabriel Duvall. He had two brothers who were killed in the Southern campaign. They were members of the Continental Army, the Maryland line. They were killed in the Southern campaign in South Carolina during the Revolution. He left the farm here, went to Annapolis, read law, and he was the clerk of the assembly and the clerk of the convention, which governed Maryland for a 2-year period until they adopted the new state constitution after the revolution started. And then he served both as a judge in Annapolis and later a member of the House of Delegates from Annapolis, and was later served parts of 2 terms in Congress while he was still in Philadelphia. He came back here to this area and was comptroller of the Treasury under Thomas Jefferson, and inherited some of this property. And when he went on the court, he built this this house here because he did not have to be in Washington all the time. The house stayed in his family up through the first decade of the present century. It was sold out of the family, then a succession of owners in the late 60s. It was sold by the last owners. He wanted to find a good home for it to Park and Planning Commission. And that briefly is the historical background. The house perhaps dates somewhere from around 1814, 1815, along that period. There are a couple other structures in the county that are very similar in appearance. The facade fairly plain and so forth, not quite as fancy, but you look at it, it's very similar in appearance to the front of Rossburg Inn, the main block of the house. And then there are a couple others in the county that are somewhat similar, from about the same period.
Well, many of most of you have been here on a Sunday when there's a tour. The Historical Society is part of our arrangement with the Park and Planning Commission. Conducts a tour every Sunday, held before, I believe, also. And we have special events here. The house will be